Hello, my name is Brian Rocks. Today I'm going to show you how to bake an ambient occlusion map, which can be used when creating your textures that will give your models a little more depth in the end. Now, ambient occlusion is a kind of a crude approximation of real-world lighting, um, and highlights the areas where soft shadows would be on your geometry. Now, there are a lot of settings for it. At first, I'm just going to go with all the default, and then we'll get into tweaks and also some problems you can run into when you're baking out the maps. So let's get started. I have this crude, ugly, random geometry here. First, we need to unwrap this, and I've got the UV image editor open over here. So I'm going to go ahead and unwrap this. I'm going to select all these faces and U to unwrap, and I'm just going to use Smart UV Project for speed purposes, and I'm going to do 0.1 for the island margin, which will give a little space between all the UV islands. So hit OK. Okay, and there we go. We got your unwrapped model here. Now we need to create an image texture, or just an image, I should say. So go new, and I'm just gonna type AO bake, and I'll just leave the 1024 as it is and turn off the alpha. We don't need that. And OK, and there we go. We got our image. I'm going to go ahead and change the viewport shading to textured. And you can see it's black and just matching the image over here. Now for the bake settings, just a quick setup here in the world setting tab. I'm going to leave everything default. Only thing, I'm just going to turn on the ambient occlusion, and I'm going to change that to multiply. And I'll leave the samples at 5 for now. We'll tweak those a little later. And go to your render tab and leave everything as is for the moment, and go down here to bake and select ambient occlusion in the bake mode. And down here in the margin, this tells the tells Blender how many pixels out from the edge of the UV island to render, whether it's ambient occlusion or your texture itself. 16 is kind of much. I usually use 4. It works fine, and so that'll extend past this UV edge here by 4 pixels all around on the whole map. So go ahead, and with those settings in place, just hit bake. And that is that, and you can see what that margin number did. See, it's 4 pixels extended all around, and it kind of hides seams that way as well, especially with this Smart UV Project that we did. It separates the model into not necessarily incoherent islands, but creates a lot of seams, and it helps to have that little buffer there to cover the seams up. So if I tab out of edit mode here, and when you're in textured shading, you can see what that does. And you can see it's really grainy, but that's because I left the samples to 5, and that just creates a grainy shading here. But for illustration purposes, you can see what that does. You can see the shading extends a little past here, and it gives a little more depth to the model, as to say just flat shading there. So how do we use this when creating a texture? Because this on its own is fairly useless, unless you just wanted a gray shaded model. So let's go ahead and save this image. And oops. I'm just going to save PNG here and call it AO Bake. And I'm going to open GIMP, and I'm going to drag this in here. And now I'm going to create a new layer, same size. I'm just going to leave it default settings here, and I want to move it down to the bottom. Now this would be like your color layer or any kind of texture that you're going to paint on your model. So for the moment, I'm going to turn off the AO Bake layer so we can just see the bottom layer. I'm just going to put a quick flat color in here. And then I'm going to enable the AO Bake layer, and you can see that doesn't really do much for you, but if you go to your mode, whether it's in Photoshop or GIMP, and you're just going to go to your multiply mode, and you can see that overlays that, and you can see all the shading and everything here. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out. And we'll just call this AO color test. And then actually I'm going to save just that layer, so we have a point of comparison. And I'll just do that, call that flat. Alright, go back into Blender here, and now let's go apply this texture to this model here. I'm going to move that out of the way. And let's go ahead and apply material. Have your object selected, and material tab. Looks like I already got one selected. I'm going to go ahead and delete that and do a new one. Okay. And we'll just call this AO color, and to the texture tab here, and create new, and under the type just pick image, and we will open our color test, and scroll down a bit, and under the mapping we want to change that to UV. And we can see, if we just change this over, now go into edit mode and change that over, and you can see before rendering what that's going to look like. And I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. And I'm going to actually remove this material from that object and do a new one, and we'll just call this flat color. Now you could have just, I could just change the color here and just use a regular material, but I want to show you what it looks like with a texture map with and without the ambient occlusion involved. So after you have that flat color created, create a new texture, and again image. We'll open that up and just do flat color image that we saved, and go down to UV, and I'm going to go in edit mode and pick that flat color. So now you can see the you can see the difference there. You have a little more depth here, and actually I'm going to get rid of this sun lamp that I have, because then you can really see the difference without the shadows. Without a light, you have just this flat, nondescript silhouette here, and with that AO, the ambient occlusion map involved with your textures, you can see the depth with that. I'm going to undo that so we have the sun lamp again. And so now let's go over some tweak settings here for the occlusion map. I'm going to bring this one back. Select the object again, we're going to edit mode. Okay, now we're going to bake another map out here. But this time we're going to switch some settings. Under the Ambient Occlusion tab, or I mean the World tab, sorry, in Ambient Occlusion, this factor number is going to be how bright you have. So if we say I'm going to crank it up to 5, go back here to the Render tab, and I'm going to bake that out. And you can see it's brighter than the one we had before. Pop that up. Switch that to normal. You can see the gray here. And this is a lot lighter. You can also affect how bright or say washed out. It will affect the transition between the shading and the flap color here. You can also crank this up here as well. Say, like, put that 2 and the environment light, and that'll also brighten it up a little bit. And you can see it's washing out the shading a little bit there. I usually don't use this unless you have some really dark areas, and it's a lot of tweaking really, because every model is going to be different how you have this set up. Bake that out again, and really the only one you need most of the time is just this factor setting. Excuse me. You know, 1.5 works. Multiply, because if you use add, I believe it just gives a flatter. Well, maybe not. But I usually use multiply because it'll give you a darker contrast, or better contrast between the light and the shadow. Another setting on that World tab with the Ambient Occlusion selected there is the samples. That's where this graininess comes in. You just turn this up. 10 will smooth that out. Rebake that here. It does take a little longer the more samples you have, and also the more complex model you have will affect the render time. And you can see here it's smoothed out quite a bit. I'm going to actually do that. I'm going to rebake this here. So you can see what that looks like. Oops. And it didn't really smooth that out because I think I have this texture. I'm going to remove all this material I have on here. And for some reason it's not affecting the preview window like it normally should. So normally it'll just readjust every time you bake this out. But either way, you can mess with the settings for to remove the grain from the occlusion by just messing with the samples here. And also you can, in the Render tab, crank up the alias settings as well, and that will smooth it out. Whoops, let me go back here. And there you can see we get a little smoother even. So that's the basics of baking out a map. Now things to look out for when doing it. I ran into this problem earlier when I was working on something else. I had the environment light on, Oops, selected. Turn that back down to 1. And it was set to sky color. And the sky color was this dark gray here. Oops. Back out. And when I baked it out, I'm going to change the samples back down just for speed. And when I did bake that out, and for some reason it isn't cooperating. Now you can see how dark that is. I thought it was black, but that sky color really affects how that occlusion works when you're baking that out. So I just have that set to white if you have it selected. Even if it's not selected, it will affect it. So just remember not to have the sky color on unless you want it to, say, affect it in any which way. Because if you change the sky color and render it, see, now that worked out okay. Because I didn't have sky color there. Let me do that again here. There we go. You can see how that reacts. Change that back to white. Crank that back down. Now another thing, the ambient occlusion calculations take into account everything in the scene. So if we have another object in here, I'm going to just throw a cylinder in, I'll scale it down a little bit. Move that out. And I'll put this up front here so we can see it a little better. And if we bake that, you can see we have shadows here. And for some reason it's not reacting on my preview window here. Even though I've reset the map selection. Yeah, it's not, for some reason it's not reacting here. Well, maybe a little bit, but anyway, on the map you can actually see how that cylinder affected the shadowing. So now you have a shadow here, and if you didn't want that, you'd either have to hide this or move it to a different layer and not render that layer. So just take into account when you're doing the maps for any object that anything in the scene, anything around it's going to affect it. You can move stuff away from it, like if it's out here, it's not going to affect it at all. It's just when it's you know, within a certain range. I don't know what that would be, but when it's close enough to create a ambient shadow, then it's going to do so. So that's pretty much the gist of making a ambient occlusion map to use with your textures. So give it a shot. Now when you're in Photoshop or GIMP, I mean, the only setting I've used is, of course, the multiply. And if, say, you needed, say this is a little darker here, ugly color here, and then you need that to be actually a little lighter because this does darken the underlayer a little bit. You can always brighten it up a little bit, change the contrast and tweak stuff like that. Something, you know, stuff along those lines. Just instead, you could also rebake your map out, rebake your map to be brighter as well, you know, by selecting a higher factor here, or even using the energy setting on the environment lighting. set to white, because you can get it really washed out if you need to, and this will be, areas like this will be really bright, and but your shadowing won't be as pronounced. So you always got to take that into account. It's a lot of messing around and messing with the settings. So that's about the gist of it. Thank you for watching.